to the cloud, and the recording of this will be available on the Stevenson Family Engagement YouTube channel. I am very, very pleased that you all joined us. I am very happy to welcome Shlok Karad from Charlie Health. Charlie Health is one of the partners of Stevenson High School and is suggested as a partner by our social workers for our students who would benefit from a little bit of outside support. We also have Janet Sushinsky with us. Janet is a social worker at Stevenson High School. She has been a trusted and valued member of our community for many, many years. And we are thrilled that both of these people have decided to join us and share their time. We also have Coach Bauman with us tonight, who is a football coach. And I'm really happy that you're with us, Coach, because we also have a coach's perspective, which is terrific. Shlok, without further ado, if you would begin the presentation. I do know that we have a golfer who also does track, and we have the parent of a wrestler who is also interested in track and field. So that's sort of who has identified themselves thus far. And as people feel confident and comfortable to ask questions in the chat, I will relay those.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me, to the entire Stevenson community. As was mentioned, my name is Shlok. I work with Charlie Health. I'll give a quick background and kind of an overview of what we're going to touch on, but the broad strokes of this is that we're going to talk about stress and the athlete. There's a lot of things to pay attention to, and a lot of things that can impact the mental health of students. And so putting another added layer on top of that with athletic competition can it can make it all the more important and necessary to make sure we're addressing mental health concerns. So we'll get into this, and I'll definitely go over some high level overview of what to look out for, what stress is, how it can impact us, and then we'll hopefully have some time for questions towards the end. So a little background on myself. So I have my doctorate in clinical psychology, and prior to working with Charlie Health, where I've been for about 1.5 years, I was practicing as a clinical psychologist in a group private practice. I did my doctorate here in Chicago at one of the schools downtown, but also my master's in psychology, had a concentration in sport and exercise psychology. My doctoral dissertation was actually also on athletes who have undergone career-ending injury and all the things that come with that, the identity loss, the difficult adjustments, etc. And so I think that there is a lot of my background that is applicable to this topic, and I'm excited to just talk through some of that with you all. Currently, I am the senior manager of clinical outreach at Charlie Health. Charlie Health is a mental health company, one of the partners of Stevenson, and really a wonderful program to just help support the adolescents and young adults that need a little bit more than the once-a-week mental health support. So we can get into that later. Or if any of y'all want to learn more, you can reach out to me separately. But for the purposes of today, we're going to just dive into the topic of stress and the athlete. So the focus areas that we're going to address today. So first of all, just what is stress? I think that it's important for us to recognize what are we looking out for, and how do we even define it? So we'll go over the definitions, kind of the scientific definitions of it. We'll talk about common pressures that athletes might face, both in sport and just in life in general, because they definitely overlap. We'll talk a little bit about the impact of stress on an individual. And then we'll go over some quick resources and how to help some of the athletes who might need some support. So first and foremost, let's just talk through what is stress. So broad definition, a state of worry or mental tension caused by a difficult situation. It's as defined by the World Health Organization. So it's important to recognize that stress is a natural human response that prompts us to address the challenges and things that are going on in our lives. Going way back to the early days of humanity, right? We are stressed and our adrenaline kicks in when we have to protect ourselves. Nowadays there is all sorts of things that can cause us to feel stressed. Every single person, everyone, whether we want to admit it or not, experiences stress to some degree. So what I really want to highlight from the start is stress is normal. The issue that we're going to talk about is like when is too much, and how do we kind of identify when it's maybe too much. Let me also say too, there are technically two types of stress, and I might get to this in an upcoming slide, but there is the idea of eustress, which is like quote unquote good stress, and distress, which is bad stress, if you will. So we'll talk a little bit about good versus bad stress, but important to know that stress can be good in some ways. But too much stress on an individual can certainly have some negative impacts.
Well, before you go forward, Shalok, and we
Sure.
talk about good stress, I see your next slide is good stress and bad stress. At what age should families start thinking about, especially in terms of sports, when stress can be a motivator and stress? Because, sometimes we have junior high students or 14-year-olds who are, just coming out of elementary school. Can stress ever be a good thing for them, or is it, do we want to keep them not stressed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the earlier the better. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do anything special. I think it's just to keep an eye out for the demands that are placed upon, young kids for tryouts and trying to make certain teams, or joining a sport and trying to perform well, whatever it might be. Whenever they start playing sports, I think it's important to keep an eye out for how are they adjusting to the pressures, the expectations? How are they talking about it? What kind of pressure are they even putting on themselves? Mental health, there's no age where it just starts to impact us, right? The mental health concerns that we go through, it can impact kids as young as, I mean, I've seen it as kids as young as like 3, right? And going all the way up to people, well into adulthood. So I think it's important to just keep an eye out for things early on and keep some open conversations, and some of that we'll get to, maybe how to do that. But yeah, if there's those 13, 14-year-olds joining like starting in a sport, that's absolutely a time where they can experience stress. And you mentioned something too, should we keep them not stressed? I think the important thing to recognize too is like the idea of keeping them not stressed is probably not going to happen, but can we understand like, hey, they are going to feel some stress, and how can we respond to its presence? How can we try to mitigate some of the stressors, build good habits with dealing with the stressors, etc.? Because stress is going to happen in life whether we like it or not. So we have to learn kind of how to ride the bumps and the ups and downs as they come, right? So yeah, that's a great question. So let's talk a little bit about good stress versus bad stress. Just alluded to it a little bit. Good stress, it can be motivating, right? It can cause an increase in adrenaline. And if you think back to the example I gave of early humanity days, it really is like the fight or flight response that is innate and kind of built into our beings. Our adrenaline will kick in and our bodies will respond in ways if we feel that we're threatened somehow, right? So this can be really, really motivating for athletes as well, for student athletes as well. And it can help with performance, right? If I'm worried that I'm going to lose my starting job, maybe my adrenaline kicks in and maybe I can kind of push a little bit harder or something like that, right? So there are ways that it can help things like performance. And it is often within student athletes' control mentally and emotionally, at least to a degree, right? How can I kind of use the stress to help me get to the next level in my journey? But very quickly that can come to a tipping point, and it can tip over to bad stress. Bad stress, feeling overwhelmed and unable to cope effectively with unmanageable pressures. We perceive the stressors as a threat that will have a poor outcome rather than something that might be able to motivate us. Think of a mindset of being defeated prior to anything happening, maybe feeling overwhelmed, not being able to handle whatever the situation might be. Again, these are very broad things, but I think as I'm talking, I'm sure that there are scenarios coming to mind for all of you, where you've seen something like this, or maybe personally you've experienced something like this as well. We'll talk a little bit about achievement motivation here too. Kind of the idea that good stress piece, right? That desire, that drive to achieve something, that can be harnessed in a positive way. So positive relationships between achievement, motivation, and athletic performance do exist. Again, if it is, how can I get to that next level of performing? How can I run a little bit faster, or do a little bit more in practice, or train a little bit harder in the weight room, or whatever it might be, right? There's that desire and determination to improve performance. Motivation is one of the basic innate drives for all of our actions, especially when it comes to athletic performance. And it is very much focused on the outcome. And it's very much driven by goals. It's like, I want to achieve X, Y, and Z. And so what do I need to do to get there? Can I break that down into smaller goals, etc.? This is a way that stress can be really useful, right? Because people can use these things as motivation to take that next step as athletes. So I think the reason that I want to spend a little bit of time at the start of this presentation talking about this is stress definitely always gets a bad rap, and understandably so, right? There's a lot of negative things that can be associated with it. We will absolutely get to that. But we have to realize that there is a little bit of, there are some positive things to this idea of stress. And we have to recognize that it will, if we can keep stress maybe in what we call the zone of optimal functioning, which there's a graph that I'll explain what that is shortly, that we probably will be able to perform really well. Too little stress, maybe we're not really motivated, right? And too much stress, maybe we're a little too overwhelmed. There's kind of that middle part where it's just right, and maybe we can harness it in a positive way. So achievement motivation is just one of those things I wanted to quickly expand upon. So let's talk about common pressures and stressors, for the student athletes, right? So pressure and expectations broadly, a lot of pressure and expectations of from the self, right? Like what am I putting on myself in terms of what I need to do or what I can achieve? How am I internalizing the pressures? What are my expectations of who I should be or what I need to do, etc.? And that can be a lot to take on, especially for young folks whose brains are still developing, who emotionally, are still learning how to be themselves. It can be overwhelming a little bit. Add on top of that the societal pressures and expectations of peers, maybe of families. Maybe there was, an athlete in the family and you want to follow in their footsteps, right? Or maybe all your friends are playing sports and you want to as well, or that's what the cool kids do, or whatever it might be, right? There's a lot of pressure and expectations that can fall to these student athletes that we maybe don't always recognize. Take this a little bit of a step further, culture of pressure, right? So at a high achieving school like Stevenson, and like a lot of the schools in Chicagoland that have a wonderful reputation academically and athletically, I think that there is a lot of environmental pressure broadly that goes on too. So we talked a little bit about that social piece, what it means to perform well, what it means to do well, what it means to be an athlete, etc. But also maybe that emotional piece, like what is the emotional toll of it? How much anxiety is coming up as a result of this? Is there an impact on someone's mood or ability to focus effectively in other areas of their lives? The motivation piece comes in too. is too much pressure demotivating? Is no pressure not motivating enough, right? So there's a lot of things that we have to consider. And that high achieving environment, I think, can be a wonderful thing. There can also be some downsides to it as well. Demanding schedules, I'm sure that this is something that's frequently experienced by folks who have a kid in a sport, or who maybe are a student athlete themselves. I mean, you have so many things to juggle. You have your sport, you have academics, you have extracurricular activities, you have your social life, because that's a very important thing. You want to be able to spend time with your friends, and family. Let's say that too. Of course, you need to spend time at home and have some downtime. Maybe someone's working a job or has to kind of figure out, like, do they have time to work, anything like that. And frankly, free time, right? Time to unwind, time to decompress, because if you don't rest, it's a lot harder to then do all the things that you have to do. So to balance all these things is a lot, especially when some of these things can be so fluid. The season can go a little longer than anticipated. Practices can run over. Extracurriculars can get in the way. If there's a club or something, and there's a trip, or academics, homework on one night versus homework on another can be completely different, right? So a lot of fluidity here and lots of things to juggle. That's a lot for someone who's 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. Well in my 30s, and I have trouble handling all of this, right? So if we think about all the things that we have to attend to in our lives, and then add athletics on top of there, that's a lot. And then I think the idea of handling disappointment, right? If someone does not make a team, or if someone does not perform well, how can they navigate that mindset? And what is the impact then, going back to that social piece, right? The expectations of other people. What will, like that, let's think of those comparison pieces, right? What will others think of me because I had a bad game, or I made a huge mistake and it cost our team the game, or everyone made the team but me, right? That's a lot.
Okay, I want to just stop you here, because from the parent or guardian's point of view, right? So the athlete's feeling these pressures, or going through this sort of roller coaster of pressures. So then how do you, as a family member, right? I had children when my kids played sports, team sports, individual sports. It's a little bit of a different, if your athlete is the one that blows the play, that's one thing, and everybody can see it. That's one thing. If they're on a one-on-one individualized sport, and they just, I don't know, whatever happens, and they don't perform the way they want to, right? There's so many different ways that families have to sort of deal with this. Let's kind of go through, like, so as a parent or a guardian, the expectation of, sometimes when you go from an elementary district to a high school district, and you were the star, and in your elementary school, which, it's great. And then maybe there's other students who are also the stars, and there's a leveling out that happens. How do you, as a parent, sort of help your athlete with the stress of, I'm not what I thought I was, or I am still what I was. It's not like I've gotten worse, but I'm in a different level of playing.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? Going to, I think, what's the phrase, right? Big fish in a small pond to a small fish in a big pond, maybe, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that there's even one or two things necessarily specifically to do, but I think the broader idea of normalizing that it's going to be a difficult adjustment, not necessarily adding to the pressure that the student athlete already faces and is probably putting on themselves, because they feel that, like, I was really good, and all of a sudden now I'm kind of middle of the pack, right? With how good I am in this bigger school or this district, right? And we'll talk about some of the, like, ways that parents can help their kids. Just a couple kind of simple tips, right? But I think the biggest thing is, like, there's probably already a lot of internal pressure happening for the kid. what are we doing to make sure we're not making that worse? Right.
Yeah.
Because too much at such a young age, yes, we want to make sure that they have kind of a resilient mindset and whatnot. And I know that there is a lot of value to some of that. They can also buckle under that pressure quite easily after, you know, especially if that pressure is sustained, right? So after some time, we have to really recognize, is the way that I'm framing this impacting how they're viewing it? And can
And yeah,
I
sometimes that's really hard because sometimes that human on the field represents the human and maybe parents or guardians and grandparents and older or younger brothers and sisters. You know what I mean?
absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. And going back to that orange box at the start, right? The pressure and expectations of family and you know, legacy athletes and whatnot, right? It's, I mean, there's a lot there. And so I think it's important for us to make sure that that families that you know, just the environment in general is providing a balanced perspective, if you will, right? A balanced approach to how we are framing the sport, the performance, the you know, well, we'll just leave it at that. Maybe the how they're framing the performance. We want to find that balance of being motivating, but not pushing so hard that we're all of a sudden putting even too much pressure and leading them on kind of the bad side of that stress. It's a tough balance to find, and there's no way that anyone's going to be perfect at it. But it's just really important to pay attention to how we're talking about these things. And can we validate their concerns around, yeah, like this is a huge adjustment going from somewhere where you were really great at you know, you were the best basketball player in your school to now, like, yeah, hey, you're on the team, but maybe you're not a starter, right? And that can be a big adjustment. So we'll get more a little bit into
Right.
like
As you keep going, I'm going to ask you just for maybe some starting sentence stems that families can sort of think about adding to their
Sure.
conversations as they're talking to their athletes.
Yeah, let me think on that. That's a great point. Of how, yeah, I would say, and we can get into some specific examples in a
Yeah,
bit,
you don't
but
have to do it now, just as we're kind of,
yeah,
I know you have much more to talk about.
yeah, general idea I would say is you want to validate the concerns. And then on top of that, maybe offer a perspective that is more flexible than just a, you know, then what you don't want to go is the, what I say, the suck it up route, which tends to be way more harmful than anything else. And we hear that a lot with parents and kids in high performing sports. So we'll talk more about that definitely. So there's three kind of focus areas that I want to get to at the bottom, but what I really want to highlight is the ACSM, really well known and reputable kind of governing body for sports medicine, highlighted the necessity to pay attention to both physical and mental health for the impact on performance. If you are not in a good space mentally, that's going to impact your ability to perform. Just as you might be injured physically, going to impact your ability to perform. So can we be the healthiest possibly physically and mentally to make sure that we are giving ourselves the best chance at performing? Very important to recognize athletes are not immune to depression and anxiety. And frankly, I believe there are some studies out there that are starting to show higher rates of mental health concerns in athletes because of all the pressures and expectations that they're going through. So, you know, athletes are glorified in society, right? And you know, the star quarterback or the, you know, the starting point guard or, you know, whatever it might be, right? Someone who's really good. And yeah, there might be a lot of things that they do well and a lot of things that might be going well for them in life. They also probably have a lot more pressure on them than anyone ever realizes. And that is a lot for a child to handle. The ACSM estimates that 35% of elite athletes, and that's elite athletes, remind, you know, one word I want to say. So athletes in general, probably even higher. 35% of elite athletes struggle with burnout, depression, eating disorders, and anxiety. So three key focus areas that we want to address: recognition of what's going on, how to manage it, and then how to prevent it. So we're going to talk a little bit here about recognition. We're going to go kind of focus area by focus area. So the impact of stress. I mentioned the zone of optimal functioning, right? This is called the Yerkes-Dodson law, also known as the stress bell curve. So if we think about it, the more stress you feel, the better performance gets up until a certain point, because then the more activated and stressed and the more arousal overall. And arousal, think like someone who's like really experiencing a lot of adrenaline and might be like really in the heat of competition. There's a certain point where the performance is going to be impaired because anxiety and feeling overwhelmed and inability to focus and inability to clearly think through what they need to do, like those things are going to impact performance, and performance is going to suffer, right? We talked a little bit about it earlier, and on the bottom axis, the x-axis, right? If stress is too low, right? If arousal is too low, it's hard to get them to pay attention, to be interested, right? But too much, we're also seeing a dip in performance. The zone of optimal functioning is right there at the top of that curve. How can we recognize that there is a balance we need to find with stress, and that's going to allow us to perform strongly? And if we go too much to either side of it, we're going to see that dip in performance. So we need to try to do anything we can to stay in the middle of that curve. One of the big things to recognize, and this is probably the most important topic that we're going to kind of spend time on here, stress can lead to athlete burnout. Then burnout can be it can mean a number of things. It can have a number of signs, and so these are just things that I want to highlight. You can see that decrease in performance. You can see fatigue, irritability, and negative attitude. Burnout shouldn't be on there twice. That's my bad. A little bit redundant, but it is something that happens when too much stress sustained over a long period of time is there for the athlete. Loss of enjoyment or interest, right? Feelings of isolation, increased self-criticism and negative self-talk, increased injury risk because maybe they're not training in the same ways that they need to, or they're not focused on their form, or they're not paying attention to things during sport that they might otherwise pay attention to when they're kind of in the best headspace. They might have eating issues, eating disorders, even mood swings and mood concerns, things like depression, or even other more serious things. Social withdrawal, decline in self-esteem, and impacts on other areas of functioning, things like academics, social life, other things can very much be impacted by burnout and kind of feeling overwhelmed with stress.
Okay, I'm going to step in now and ask you for some of those sentence stems. I'm a family member. I see some of this. I have a teenager, right? Teenagers, it's at 6:05 and at 6:10, they're different people. At 7:04, they're a different person, and at 8:12, they're a different person, right? They could be having some of these. How am I not sort of in a healthy, supportive, regulated way, right? How am I what are some sentence stems that I can use with my athlete? Some examples of, or some, because I don't want to call the coach every 5 minutes, I think, right? Then I'm calling him 10 times a night, right? Because the coach don't want to hear from me. So, but what am I doing to help my teen sort of recognize maybe they're under stress, to not stress them out further, but to be supportive? So give me some examples of what I might be able to say.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions coming to mind, and it's a pretty simple one, honestly, but one that can, I think, open a lot of doors, is just sitting them down one-on-one and asking, so how are you doing? But really, how are you doing? How are you handling everything that you have to deal with right now? Right? Especially if you start to notice some of these things in these gray squares, there's a lot of ways that you can check in. If they're fatigued, saying, I've noticed that you seem a little bit more tired lately. Is everything okay? Right? If they're feeling isolated, right? I mean, broadly, we want to approach all of these in as non-judgmental the way as possible, because they're already, again, probably feeling that internal stress, that internal pressure, and they're probably already having those self-judgment, negative self-comments and negative self-talk, self-criticism, etc. So, I've noticed you haven't been hanging out with your friends as much lately. Is everything okay? Right? seems like you're being really hard on yourself. Let's talk through what's going on, right? Little conversation openers like that, open-ended, non-judgmental, I think can really make your child, your athlete, your student athlete, right, feel validated, feel empowered, feel heard, and feel seen, right? Because they might think that they can't really talk about this because they don't want to be perceived as a poor performer or as weak or whatever it might be. So I think it's really important that as parents, folks do that, as coaches, as teachers, as whatever, whatever the role might be. Really important to check in and kind of invite these conversations if we're noticing some of these changes over time. So open-ended,
Yeah,
non-judgmental.
perfect. I think you mirrored a lot of what Janet Sushinsky, the social worker, mentioned. And Janet, if you want to unmute yourself and jump in, I've noticed that how are you feeling? Identify the behavior.
Yeah, I think it's those conversation starters, like he had mentioned it, but I think it's specifically identifying the behavior. You're not seeing your friends as much. You seem to be pushing your food around on the plate a lot more, and not enjoying the good meals I've cooked or whatever. But identifying the behavior, and then, like you said, asking open-ended questions.
Okay, thanks. Just didn't want you to go. I didn't want to have to backtrack a lot. So thanks, everyone.
Of course, of course.
So could I ask a question?
Please.
I know you talked a lot about how parent guardians can help support their athletes, but since not everyone has that available to them, what can I do as a teammate, especially if I'm more of the like older sister teammate? Like, what can I do for fellow teammates?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I that's a great point too. I'm glad you brought that up. Not everyone's going to have that same trust and the like safety that others might have. And they might not have someone to go to, or at least they may not feel that they do. So I think in your role as the kind of older teammate that's looking out for others, you can invite these same conversations, right? And, hey, I've noticed a little bit of a change. Like, I'm here if you want to talk, right? How are you doing? I think those same conversations can apply, and you can have those open conversations as a friend, as a peer, as a teammate, and maybe even if you're comfortable, of course, that's not something you have to do, but sharing a little bit of any struggles that you've had so that they know, like, hey, maybe I'm not alone in this, right? That's a great point you brought up, and I want to thank you for asking that question. I would say inviting those same conversations is something that anyone can do. It doesn't just have to be a family member.
Thank you.
All right. So signs of burnout, kind of similar to the last slide, but I wanted to highlight a few more things and recognize that there are probably 3 domains of it. Physical, you may notice more fatigue. You may notice them feeling tired, drained. You may notice frequent illness, right? Lowered immunity because maybe they're not sleeping as well or eating properly or whatever it might be. Frequent headaches, muscle pain, appetite changes, sleep habit changes, and frankly, also I will say injury in general, or repetitive injury could be a sign. Could also add to burnout. Emotional signs, sense of failure and self-doubt. If someone's really hard on themselves, critiquing themselves, feeling helpless, trapped, or defeated, feeling detached or feeling alone in the world, not motivated, really negative and cynical outlook, or kind of a decreased sense of satisfaction and sense of accomplishment, even maybe undercutting their own accomplishments when something goes well, and kind of giving that idea of like, yeah, it's not good enough, or it's not a big deal. That's something that might might be worth inquiring about. Not necessarily always a sign of burnout, but something to just keep an eye out for, especially if multiple of these things start popping up. And then, excuse me, behavioral. Withdrawing from responsibilities, isolating selves from others, procrastinating, taking longer to get things done, whether that's, and I would say procrastination maybe beyond a normal level. I think we all tend to procrastinate at times. Maybe not everyone always wants to do homework or whatever it is, right? But if you're kind of noticing a change in, from what their baseline is, in any of these, that's an important piece to look out for. Using food, drugs, other, alcohol, any substances to cope with their kind of emotional distress. taking out frustrations on others, skipping school, practice, or coming in late, leaving early, those kind of behavioral habit changes, if you will, that are just a departure from whatever their normal behavior is. So lots of things to look out for here. And if you start seeing 1, 2, 3, 4 of these, you might want to question, hey, what's going on? Maybe I need to kind of talk to this individual and see, is there something going on? How can I support them, etc.
Something I want to add, what I see as the social worker is students that have been in their chosen sport, let's say for 10 years or so by the time they get to high school, and they are burnt out, but they are worried they don't want to disappoint their parents. So be open as parents to have that conversation to say, if you're not enjoying this anymore, if this is not bringing you pleasure, let's talk about how do you step back? How do we find ways? Maybe it's not at this level of competition, but it's at this level. Or just all in all, just quitting and trying something different, because I see that a number of times where they're afraid to bring up that conversation with the parents because they've seen how much the parents have invested time and money and effort and all that. So these are really good indicators of, hey, it's really time for us to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you mentioning that. And I think it reminds me a little bit of one of the things that we're kind of trained to look out for, from a clinical standpoint, is like, what is the function of the behavior, right? If the function is to appease others and I'm not getting anything out of it myself, that's a big warning sign, right? That's a red flag. And so if the athlete, if the student athlete feels that they have to do this for other people and not for their own enjoyment, their own love of competition or the sport or fun or whatever it is, definitely something to dig deeper and kind of figure out what's going on and what do we do here. So that's a great point. So management and prevention kind of on an individual level, like what the student athletes themselves can do. You want to develop healthy coping skills, right? So things like breathing exercise and other things to promote relaxation, to try to give yourself a good kind of headspace from which to approach things. I mean, there's a million different coping skills out there, and I didn't want to take up so many slides and list them all. But I'm sure the social work team and whomever, I can also send you some ideas if you need them. But I think the overall idea is like, you want to do things that just help yourself cope with the difficulties that life is going to bring, right? Sport, school, etc. They're all going to lead to stress in some form. How can we cope with them in a healthy way? You want to give yourself time to unwind as well. Exercising, not performance related. What I mean by that too is exercising just to exercise or decompress versus exercising to train for something, right? Those are two different things. When you're training for something, you're trying to achieve something. That's not necessarily exercising to cope with stress, right? So it's important to know that distinction. Exercise is one of the best coping mechanisms out there, but how we use it is very important. Talking to others is huge. It is so easy to feel alone and isolated and think that we're the only one going through this or feeling this way or thinking these things. I can almost guarantee you that that's not true. We had, and I'm forgetting her name. I'm sorry, but the individual who just asked the question about how can I be the good teammate and invite some of the support my teammates, invite these conversations. You kind of recognize that like other people are going through this too. Talking about these things is it's like the best thing you can do, right? Or talking to a professional if you're not comfortable talking to parents, coaches, teachers, etc. Talking to a mental health professional it can be a huge resource. And then eating, sleeping well, making sure these kinds of things that we have to do day in and day out are in balance and happening regularly so that we can feel like we're keeping up with what we need to keep up with. Acknowledging and expressing your stress and emotion, kind of going to the talking to others. We all feel, whether we want to admit it or not, we all feel emotions. We all struggle with mental health at times, in small ways, in big ways, whatever it might be. Nobody's immune to it. Talking about it with people, whomever it may be, can help decrease distress. And then even things just like time management, right? Building in enough time to get everything done, taking mental health breaks, making sure you have time to get your homework done. You have time to prioritize social and family time. You have time to unwind by yourself. You have time to practice. You have time to, do whatever else that needs to get done. Balance with time management is huge. Management and prevention from a family standpoint, we really talked a little bit about this already, but I think something to just recognize, some things to recognize, learn to look out for and recognize the signs of stress and burnout that we went over a little bit ago. Look out for those behavior changes. Really recognizing like what is a person's baseline and is there any change from what that baseline is for each individual. Everyone's baselines can be different. So if I have certain habits and all of a sudden people notice a change, like, okay, Shlomo always procrastinates on his homework, but wait, now he's starting to procrastinate on all these other things as well. That's a behavior change. That's something we want to keep an eye out for. Inviting open, non-judgmental conversations. This is what we just talked about a little bit with some of those sentence starters, right? Not always about toughening up or pushing harder. This can be an incredibly difficult time in your child's life where they're feeling the weight of the world and literally in some forms, right, on their shoulders. So how do we validate their concerns? How do we not dismiss it? How do we listen? And I mean, truly listen to them and help them get connected to then resources that will help them, whether that is, at Stevenson in the community, or maybe it is like, how do you identify and lean into resources that you have already existing in your life? Is there another trusted person you can talk to? Are there friends that you can go to for this? Can you, figure out a way to change your schedule, drop an extracurricular if it feels like it's too much, whatever it might be. So really just validate, open up a conversation, and let your child express themselves.
Okay, I have a question for you.
Go for it.
One back.
Yeah.
So Janet,
Yes.
this is for you and Janet, and maybe Coach. So I'm a family member whose child has been playing fill in the blank sport since they were 5 or 6 or 8, whatever. They've been playing for a long time. The other families in that sport are my friends. Our lives sort of revolve around, maybe the sport doesn't have only one season. Maybe there are, in season, off season, now it doesn't seem like there's winter, spring, and summer sports. They're just sort of amorphous sports that happen all the time. And my child comes to me at 16 or maybe 17 and says, not so much. But now, how do I, as a family member, as the parent of that, how do you suggest I deal with that loss for me as a parent? That is not only the child saying, I don't want to play fill in the blank sport anymore. That's a loss of, or maybe my student doesn't make a team and was wonderful and then doesn't necessarily achieve what they wanted to, or gets in a fight with their friend, whatever it is, there is a loss of the sport. What do you suggest for an adult to deal with that loss? Because that can be loss of a social group, that can be loss of that's the way I structured my time. What do I do?
And I can answer that. I'm also, for the people in the Zoom here, I'm also a parent of a high-level competitive teenage player. I think, Mara, that's a great question. With her going off to college, I'm already anticipating that loss. You've got to find your people. You've got to find who are your supports. Maybe people that you knew that their kids aged out of the sport, is to talk to them about what was it like for you. And you have to grieve that loss, because it is a big loss when you're that involved with that much time and commitment. You see them more than you see a lot of your family. And so I think it's keeping your own issues away from your child is first and foremost. Finding your people who can you go to for that loss, and honor it, that this is a big transition for you as well. No, you're not the athlete, but you have been there for everything along the way. And it's important that you take time to grieve that. Does that make sense, Mara?
it's, yeah, I mean,
Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I'm the parent of two mid 20-year-olds.
Hmm.
So I know I went through,
Right.
not being like having all sorts of time and looking at my partner going, okay, so now what do we do?
Right.
You know,
I'll be coming to you for help.
I can't give you good advice.
And I think it was an important point too, that like the losses, there's multiple avenues of that, right? Even if the student, your child doesn't want to do the sport anymore, that's still a loss they have to grieve as well.
Right.
Right. And of like, well, what will people think, or am I quit, or whatever comes with it.
Right.
And so I think yeah, keeping your grief and loss around it as separate from your child's grief and loss around it as possible, validating any and all experiences around it, recognizing that it's tough for them, it's tough for us, but how can I in this moment make sure that my kid is okay, and then also make sure after that I'm okay, because of course we don't want to guilt them into saying like, yeah, but like we really love going to these games, and then all of a sudden your kid's going to probably feel worse about not
Right.
doing it, or maybe then they're going to do it for the wrong reasons, right? And so I think it's certainly an issue that is a little bit complex, but and as I feel like one of the words I've said a million times in this presentation, right? It's balance. It really has to be, and validating your own grief and loss around it is super important. But recognizing that we don't want to put that on our child in that moment. Yeah.
And I would also add, I would try to have an open conversation about what's the why behind it. If it's burnout, or if did something happen with a teammate or a coach that has damaged them in some way. And so to try to have it open, if it's just burnout, I've been doing it for so long, I don't like it anymore. Okay, but try to do some digging. Did something happen? Did somebody hurt you? And to try to get more information from them. And then, yeah, I'll honor their decision.
Janet, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just wanted to say that was a great point. Yeah, honor their decision. I really love that, and recognize like what might be driving it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Janet, we're on the resources available at Stevenson. So I have a student who, I think something's going on with. I'm not sure. They're still in the sport. Door is slamming all the time, but door slams all the time. What can I do to support I think something's happening, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways to do that. Is maybe ask your child, do they know how to access their social worker? Every student is assigned a social worker at the high school. So ask them, do they know how to do it? You can also email or call me, and it's, who the social worker is on the webpage. And we can have an honest and open discussion about what you're observing. I will not say to parents that I'm going to say, oh, you didn't call me. I believe in transparency. And so some parents will call me and say, don't tell them you heard this from me. Well, I can't. But I can say to a student, your parent's concerned, let's talk about that. And when I talk with students, it's confidential. So I'm not going to call the parent back and say, here's what Johnny just told me, unless the student gives me permission. Because sometimes that might be the conduit to then open up dialogue at home, is to say, I'm burnt out. I don't want to do sports anymore. My mom has gotten a second job to support it or whatever. She's going to be mad. So that way, involving me or the social worker that is on your student's team can help bridge that gap. We also have a lot of resources for stress management and different ways to handle disappointment, how to cope. We have some support groups. We have the individual counselors and social workers and psychologists. And I know that Trish Bedhauser has incorporated a lot of that stuff into her programming as well with the athletes. So when in doubt, just always reach out, and ask, hey, is there a support person for my student to talk to? And I've also often then have looped in coaches when the student has given me permission. In particular, if a kid's getting too caught up into cutting weight for wrestling, and they're kind of in this own mindset, I'll loop that coach in so it's not an unhealthy way of participating in the sport. And so, whatever we can do to help out with reducing the level of stress, helping them manage it and finding balance, is exactly what we want to do.
And Shloke, can you talk a little bit about how families might be able to reach out to like a community partner?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the general idea here, whether with Stevenson or elsewhere in the community, is that sometimes when more support is needed, it is absolutely okay, if not necessary, to go find a trained professional to help with this stuff. These are hard conversations to have sometimes. Really important that we can get kids into talk to a therapist if that's something that's appropriate, or whatever might be necessary. There are, I think here in Chicagoland, we're really blessed with a ton of resources. There are so many therapists with availability that accept all sorts of insurances, that can see people virtually and in person. So it's really about accessing whatever care that you feel is appropriate. There are programs like Charlie Health and other what we call more intensive outpatient programs, which are these programs that are for people that need more than once a week support. Maybe they just need a little bit more for X amount of weeks. That's what we do at Charlie Health, and there's a few other programs around here that do that as well. All focused on providing mental health support for the individual that needs it. It's a lot, right? I think it's difficult being a young person in general, and add on top of that all of these other added layers, and the stressors and pressures in the age of social media and comparisons to others, and what they believe they should be. And these are people trying to figure out who they are in general at that age. And now I think it's even more difficult than it was 30, 40, whatever years ago. So there's a lot of different ways to access these resources. I didn't put my contact info here, but what I will say is to really just the Stevenson team broadly, please feel free to send out my information to anyone. I'm happy to help people get connected to any program, whether it is Charlie Health or any other program. I want to make sure people get the support they need. I know that the social work team also does some of that work as well. So there's a lot of ways to kind of navigate that. And then I always have to include this, always, if there is an emergency or if there is a crisis, if there's a worry about safety or risk to a student, like risk of harming themselves or something like that, calling 911 or going to your nearest emergency room or utilizing a resource like the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline can be accessed at 988. That's the number. It can be texted, it can be called. I think there's an online chat for it. There's a lot of ways that they have made themselves accessible. Any and all resources in situations like this can help when maybe it feels like there's a crisis happening.
But thank you. Thank you, Shloke. Before we wrap this up, I do know that we have Coach Bauman with us. And Coach, I'm not sure if from a longstanding honored coach at Stevenson, I'm not sure if you have some words of wisdom that you would like to share on our webinar tonight.
I have more questions than words of wisdom. The things that you've mentioned, my grandchildren now are going to the end of their athletic careers. The things that you've mentioned about getting into a big pond after being in a small pond, all of my children as athletes lost starting positions as seniors because the lower class people were simply better. That's a difficult thing for a parent to deal with, as you mentioned, Mara, about, hey, I've been doing this all my life. Every Saturday I was going to soccer games or going to a wrestling meet or going to here and there. So right now I'm thinking about, hey, my grandkids are finished too. Now what am I going to do? Fortunately, I have investments with the kids at Stevenson. So, I can go on forever following those people. But all the things that you mentioned, all of the concerns that you mentioned, there aren't easy answers for. I don't have answers for them. And some of them I suffer myself from. On the days of games and the day before games, I am not a pleasant person to be around. I'm still dealing with stress management, and I very often talk to the kids about there's an optimal level of emotional involvement and control of yourself, and you got to be careful of where you're at. So I don't have any words of wisdom. The suggestions about, hey, I think you're unusually quiet now as prompts for getting involved in conversations, I think that's very useful. I am always concerned about senior players who may not be starters any longer, and how they handle the situation, and how we handle them as coaches. It's not an easy task. It takes understanding, it takes listening, it takes a knowledge that you're not always going to do it right. But you can try. And you need to keep looking for new ways to handle it, like this presentation this evening. That's it. I can ramble on for a long time, but
Thank you, Coach. I appreciate your perspective. It's very, very valuable for families to hear that the coaches feel as much stress as maybe the players and their families do.
Yeah. And it's hard to deal with.
Yeah.
Because you've got the coach has got the pressure of you're expected to win. You're expected to build these kids as people, but you're expected to win too. And if you don't win.
Yeah, a lot of expectations.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you, Coach, because being at Stevenson for a long time, you have been somebody who not only taught athletic skills, but you helped build character. And that's what coaching's about. And I just wanted to thank you for that and all your hard work that you've done with our students. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate
You are
that.
a treasure. You are a treasure, Coach. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Coach Bauman for being with us. Janet, thank you so much for giving. I know that you are here on a sick day. You are nursing a sick. Go back to sleep at the end of this. Please take care of yourself. And Shlok, thank you so much for being lending your expertise and your knowledge and insights to this conversation tonight. I do know we talked a lot about finding resources in the community. If you have any questions about resources for our community, our social workers are really, really great at knowing who has openings, who doesn't have openings, and sort of how to find the resources, both at the school as well as outside. Sophia, you have a question. Do you want to put it in chat or do you want to just unmute yourself and ask?
Thank you. So my question is, to what extent do you agree with the statement, sports should cause state anxiety, like healthy nervousness from being under pressure in a game, but sports should not cause trait anxiety?
That's yeah. I'm sorry, was someone else?
No,
No,
you
I said
repeat it?
professionals. That's for you guys.
I want to hear it repeated. I couldn't hear it. Just read a little slower.
Oh yeah, of course. To what extent do you agree with the statement, sports should cause state anxiety, like healthy nervousness from being under pressure in a game, but sports should not cause trait anxiety?
What was that word? Trait?
Trait anxiety.
Yeah, I agree with the first part is that, stress helps move us in directions that are often positive. If you're at the doctor's office and he's like, you know what, you got to watch your cholesterol, that's going to increase your stress, but it also might move you towards change. So same thing as an athlete, there is productive stress like he talked about earlier. And so I do support the beginning of that statement. Yes.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it does remind me of that bell curve we looked at, right? Where,
Yeah.
In a given moment, that stress can be really helpful, right? It can put, from a sport perspective, right, push us to to maybe make sure we're fully focused at practice, and maybe we're doing a little extra on the side because we want to be that 1% better, or whatever it might be. But then comes the other side of it, where then the state anxiety, right, in a certain period of time gets into trait anxiety, which is more habitual and long term. And we don't want that to be the cause of sport, because ultimately then that also ruins the enjoyment of the sport for the individual, that's partaking in it. So I think that's a fair statement. I think it speaks to a lot of what we talked about with that, like, too much stress or too little stress can be negative, and that, middle ground is where we need to focus.
What do you
Thank
think,
you.
Sophia?
I love the answer.
You what?
Oh, I agree with the answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It was a good question. Thank you.
And did you,
Sophia,
you
go
had
ahead.
one more?
Did you have another one, or?
Oh no, that was it. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. I think that it's a really good way to end. Hang on. My son has Crohn's, is already going through some mental health issues. But how do we have a student that already has some concerns. The family has some concerns, and they are in a sport where they may not get a lot of playing time.
Sure.
So that may add to the anxiety. But the student wants to be in the sport. How can the family best support that student?
Yeah.
You know me to be blunt. I'm going to say it's not about them. It's about their kid. So if the kid is fine being second or third string, hallelujah, bless their heart. They're enjoying it.